Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Good evening, everyone. I want you, ladies and gentlemen, to take a step back and have a look at your lives. What do you see? Your successes, your failures, your life lessons, your moments, your very own mosaic. A mosaic does not hide its cracks. It turns brokenness into art. It does not demand that each piece be polished. It simply requires that each piece has a place in a bigger perspective. That's what I want to talk about today, resilience as a perspective. Let me begin with two numbers. A study by the American Psychological Association states that 67% of parents are too emotionally exhausted to connect meaningfully with their children. The Harvard Center on Developing Child states that children of emotionally attuned parents are 3 times more likely to develop empathy, self-regulation, and resilience. Do you see the paradox? The very thing that our children need the most, our emotional availability, is often the first casualty of modern life. Even more so in cultures like ours, where parenting is seen as a sacrifice and not as self-renewal. We cannot raise resilient children by breaking ourselves in the process. We cannot give from a place that we have abandoned emotionally. I have 2 boys. My older son is 22 years old and my younger one is 13. Earlier this year, my older son looked at me and said, "Mama, with everything that you have been through, I don't think I have ever seen you not smiling." At first, I smiled again. But hours later, those words sat in my chest like a stone, because that smile, it wasn't from joy. It was the armor that I wore to protect my children from the battlefield that I called my home. Let me share with you today of how my journey of self-care and healing helped transform my boys into who they are today. I was 19 years old when I was married. Back then, I had grown up believing in a script which was taught to me, and it went something like this. A good girl gets married young. She stays silent, she sacrifices, she adjusts, and if she does everything right, her reward is that of a happy and peaceful home. And so, I did everything right. The problem is, no one told me that that script itself might be broken. I didn't know the language of boundaries. I didn't know to recognize control, manipulation, isolation. I was told to call it duty. In South Asia, abuse is normalized in over 70% of marriages. Fewer than 15% of women even recognize it as abuse. Globally, 1 in 3 women are subject to domestic violence. Only 1 in 10 ever report it. I didn't report it, but I lived it. For 23 years and 10 months in a marriage where I was abused physically, emotionally, financially, mentally, and told that I am nothing but an extension of my husband. The first time I was told, "You are nothing without me," I stayed quiet. The 20th time I was told the same thing, I still stayed quiet because I was conditioned to believe that my silence was my strength. When the abuse escalated after the birth of my second son, I didn't walk away immediately because I didn't believe I could. Not financially, not emotionally, not culturally. There were mornings I woke up not knowing how to get through the day, and yet I pushed myself to never let my children see this. And so I smiled. I cooked. I cheered my boys on at school events. I was both the parent and the plaster. But behind the scenes, I was dismantling. And yet, ironically, professionally, I was flying, all while enduring that abuse at home. I qualified in the top 3% of a national level fellowship examination. I went on to pursue and complete my PhD. I published 23 of my research papers in peer-reviewed journals and presented them at 25 conferences, both nationally and internationally. Success is not always a sign of well-being. Sometimes, success is a symptom of survival. Research shows that women who are subject to long-term trauma are 3 times more likely to overachieve as a coping mechanism. For me, it was easier to drown in achievement than confront the truth. Because when you grow up in a culture that teaches you that adjustment is love and that divorce is a shame, you build these palaces of performances to escape the poverty of peace. For years, I thought, if I could just hold it all together, my children would turn out to be just fine. I believed that my sacrifices would someday translate to strength in my boys. I thought leaving my marriage meant failing until I hit what I call the invisible floor below rock bottom, when even my own silence started screaming back at me. I remember the last time I was physically abused. In the days that followed, I was forced to acknowledge the damage that this abuse was doing, not just to me, but to my children. It was time to take a decision. And so I prayed. I prayed istikhara. It is the prayer of decision making. And I remember praying, Ya Allah, if this is not for me, please make my journey ahead easier for me. And something shifted. Faith became my therapist. The Holy Quran became my cognitive restructuring tool. There is a verse in the Holy Quran, فَإِنَّ مَعَ الْعُسْرِ يُسْرًا. It translates, with hardship comes ease. I stopped asking, why me? And started asking, what now? Healing doesn't always begin with a breakthrough. Sometimes healing begins with a very simple prayer. Healing through self-care is a very focused effort. When you have lived in survival mode for so long, rest feels very unnatural. Guilt becomes your default setting, and any act of self-care feels like betrayal. Here's what we are taught. The more you give of yourself, the more good you are. The more invisible your needs, the more loved you will be. But this kind of conditioning is not resilience, and it is not healthy. This is the way we are taught to ignore ourselves. And the trigger is not always external. It's that internalized expectation that self-sacrifice is a virtue. And I had to unlearn that. Not overnight, but breath by breath. I began taking walks to return to myself. I started journaling, not just for reflection, but when you have lived in an environment where your voice is constantly silenced or dismissed, that first blank page becomes your first safe audience. I started saying no without explanation. One of the most transformative shifts in my healing came from what seemed like a very simple thing, consciously blocking time out for my boys. I didn't realize it then, but that was emotional modeling. And it wasn't just about time. It was about values it was about boundaries, and it was about dignity. Self-care doesn't subtract from your parenthood. It multiplies the impact. And no, self-care is not always pretty. Some days, self-care looks like crying and letting it all out in the shower before you go to work. Some days, self-care looks like consciously breathing for 3 minutes in between your meetings. But slowly, I built something that I hadn't done in years, an emotional margin. You don't pour into others by staying full yourselves. You pour into others by making sure that you do not run dry yourselves. When I left my marriage, I didn't just walk away from a man. I walked into a future that I was too afraid to even imagine for myself and for my children. But I did know this. Children don't just inherit your genes, they absorb your nervous system. Studies show that children of emotionally dysregulated parents are 3 times more likely to develop anxiety, aggression, and avoidant behavior well into their adulthood. I did not want that to become their story. I did not want them to grow in the lingering shadow of an unhealed parent. And so, I rewrote my story. I wasn't chasing success anymore. I was modeling self-respect and trying to provide that emotional environment that they so badly needed. At first, they were quiet. My younger son would come sit next to me but not speak much. My older son always had his guard up. But little by little, something shifted. When I stopped shouting from exhaustion and started setting clear boundaries, they relaxed. When I stopped trying to control every move and started trusting them with making their own decisions, they rose to the occasion. I woke up late one morning to find that my younger son has completed his entire morning routine all by himself. And my older one has helped see him through the process. Not out of fear, but out of ownership. When I stopped parenting from panic, they stopped living in defense mode. They started expressing their feelings more openly. They started showing more empathy, not just to the people around them, but to themselves. We started having small rituals together. Friday nights, no screens, no pressure, just my boys and me, our perfect little family. Slowly, in my home, laughter returned, spontaneity returned, and the light in my children's eyes returned. I realized my children didn't need a perfect parent. They needed a present parent, not just to say you matter, but to show them that I matter to myself. And my healing and self-care did just that. Very recently, my younger son looked at me and said, "Mama, you look very happy these days. I like you." When a parent heals, a child feels safe to grow. Rebuilding myself wasn't just an act of survival. It was the greatest gift that I could give to the future that I am raising. People often call me a success story. But success is a very narrow term for something that has so many layers, because there are still days that I cry. There are still moments that I question my self-worth. And there are still nights when I tuck my children into bed and I sit on my prayer mat with the weight of what was, what is, and what is yet to be. But I have learned this. Post-traumatic growth occurs in over 50% of trauma survivors who process their experience and use it to serve others. That is what today is. The stage and the story. It is not just a badge of honor for me that I delivered a talk on the TED platform. For me, this is a blueprint that I give to any woman who is sitting out here today who believes that she has to smile through a storm. To any father battling guilt at not being present enough for his child. To any teenager who is carrying emotional baggage and watching it being passed down like a tradition. To you, I say this: you are not broken. You are being rearranged. That is the beauty of perspective. Because perspective turns brokenness into a mosaic, and a mosaic, however fractured, is always a piece of art. Let me tell you today what I know with absolute certainty. Your self-worth is not a negotiation. Your silence is never your strength. And your self-care is not the detour. It is the road. So parents, take care of yourselves. These are not just phrases. They are the anchors of my healing. And if you are wondering how a woman who once believed that her voice did not matter is standing here today with so much of resilience, let me share with you 3 things I did. 1, I built my faith. The Holy Quran and my prayers were not just comfort zones anymore. They were my framework for turning pain into growth. 2, I built my support circle. A handful of beautiful people who showed me that healing does not need to be a lonely journey. 3, I practiced conscious parenting. I stopped parenting from pain and exhaustion and panic to parenting from presence and trust. This change didn't just heal me, it provided the emotional tools for my boys to grow into the resilient and amazing human beings they are today. This, to me, is the mosaic of resilience. A perspective that tells us that our cracks are not the endings. They are the very spaces from where light flows. My name is Dr. Shaheema Hameed, and this mosaic you see in front of you today of resilience, rupture, and renewal was not crafted in a moment. It took years of breaking and building, and if I have said anything today that helps any one of you reframe even one piece of the mosaic of your lives, then every scar, every silence, and every step that I took to stand here today was all worth it. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for listening to me.